Well, hi everybody, this is Mr. Bruzette. Today we're going to talk a little bit about what cartooning is. Now, we all go into something with our own background, our own experiences, our own biases and subjective opinions. And so that means some of you guys may have never taken a cartooning class. Maybe you've never signed up for anything but just that Design 1 class. Maybe you're interested in learning more about cartooning. Maybe you think it's an easy credit for you. But I can guarantee you one thing about cartooning, you're definitely going to have fun with it. So what comes to mind when you think of cartooning? Does something like this come to mind? And if so, who does this cartoon appeal to? Who was it made for? Was it made for children, adults, teenagers? It entirely depends on where you come from, what your background is. To some people, this is what cartooning is. Now to others, this might be what cartooning is. Something a little less kid-friendly and a little bit more accessible to moderately older audiences. But then some of you may think this is what cartooning is. Something that doesn't move, something that's an actual picture, like a comic book or a cartoon strip. It's also pretty scary looking. This would be a cartoon that appeals to people who are older. You know, it's spooky, it's scary, it's not kid accessible, not kid friendly. Likewise, some of you might be familiar with this type of cartooning, something very simple, something that doesn't have much detail in it, something that's just line work and maybe like a strip. But what if I told you that this was cartooning? What is this? That's an Egyptian hieroglyphic. That's essentially the same thing that a cartoon is doing. It's communicating a story through image, which all art does to a degree. But what sets cartooning apart from other art? Here's another example of cartooning from the Middle Ages, the Dark Ages. This is kind of an icon. A lot of people couldn't read back in the day, and this is how stories were told, through one single image or a series of images. So it's nothing entirely new. What you're looking at is actually the fruit that's growing on a tree that's been around for thousands of years. But then again, we have that thing called fine art. What makes cartooning different than this? You know, some people think cartooning has value less than normal fine art, that a painting that sells for $1 million is more valuable, in a sense, than a cartoon, that a painting and that fine art is serious business and cartooning is not. Who's to say that? In fact, a lot of fine art pieces across history, they did exactly the same thing that cartooning does. They communicated through image. They had provocative imagery. They tried to sway people by impressing the opinion of the artist onto the viewer. Another thing we could argue, let's look at the technique involved. Is the same amount of skill used in this image that was used in this image? Well, no, not in the slightest. But then again, neither was the same amount of skill used in this image with this image. So technique can vary across cartoons just as it can across art in general. So what's the difference? What is cartooning? And by the way, it could be argued that a famous painting, as you see here, can also be reproduced using cartooning techniques with even more attention to skill and technique, if you define skill and technique is what looks more real or not. But that's up to every person's personal interpretation. So let's look at cartooning in more detail. I define cartooning mainly as a method of communicating through image using simplified, exaggerated, stylized, symbolic, and also contemporary artistic techniques across a wide range of different media. Now, what the heck does that mean? Well, to communicate is to do exactly what we're doing now. And words only make up about, 10 to 20% of our communication. The majority of how we communicate is through body language and expression. And the beautiful thing about art is that art does that by nature. And that's exactly how people used to communicate when they did this, and this, and this, and this. Let's break it down again. It communicates through image, not words. Image. And it does that by simplifying things, making them less realistic looking. It does it through exaggerating things. That just means making certain things bigger or smaller in order to create emphasis. Also, it's stylized. What's that mean? Well, stylized could be something that looks like a particular artistic style, like Disney style, or that manga style, or this kind of style, which is a fusion of both. It uses symbolic things, just like those Egyptian pictures. Each element in that picture represents a different thing, and it means a different thing to that culture. So if you put a bunch of those symbols in a piece, you could say something through that piece. You'll learn more about that as we go on through the year. And contemporary just means the techniques of the day. For example, where this famous painting used traditional media, paint, things that you do with your hands onto an actual surface, versus these, which do the exact same thing, only with digital media, Typically, cartooning is limited to flat media, two-dimensional, whether it's done in an animated film, done on a three-dimensional rendering in a computer. That's still flat if you were to print it out. So how's it used? Well, cartooning is most often used in a humorous or whimsical fashion, for entertainment. Whether it appeals to kids or adults, that's the purpose of it. Cartooning as a discipline is something that's quick to learn, but it takes a lifetime to master. Most people who are cartoonists have a fine arts background. And you can tell they have knowledge of composition, of technique, of skill, of diligent training in their work. Very rarely do you find a cartoonist who wasn't trained in some manner, or who hasn't at least gone back and studied what the old masters did, that which we teach in Design 1. Many cartoonists are self-taught. Many of them also have a strong fine arts background. But both agree that composition and technique make for very strong work. It's kind of like a sports car. If you look under the hood and saw an engine made completely out of cardboard, the sports car wouldn't be worth much because it doesn't fulfill its purpose to drive fast. It may look good on the outside, but underneath the hood it may have some serious things wrong with it. The same thing applies to any artistic work, whether it's cartooning or fine art. Your education, your background knowledge, how well you've learned to put all those pieces of design principles and technique together, all of that affects the end product. It affects the quality of your end result. And so therefore, whether you're self-taught or you went and had actual design classes, cartoonists typically draw on fine art principles in order to augment their work, to make it look cool. And you're going to learn this throughout class. And that's just another example of why this is treated as an advanced course, so that students coming into cartooning have that foundation that they learn in Design 1 before moving on. Also, another very important thing about cartooning, words are optional. Most of what we're going to do in this class will be completely absent of any words. You'll be communicating stories and showing scenes and pictures and things going on strictly through image. That forces you to think and learn how to symbolize. That's what makes cartooning so successful, and that's what will make you successful after taking this course. So let's take a look at some different examples of cartooning. We've got here in the bottom corner, let's start at the right. We've got an example of a traditional simple cartoon, a cartoon where things are very, very simplified. This is a cartoon character of mine. These are all my own cartoons. And starting at the right, this character, he's got a couple of those examples of what makes a cartoon. He's simplified. We don't see his fur textures, but we know he's furry just because of the way his line work was drawn. Also, he's exaggerated. His head is very big, and he's exaggerated in certain parts to create emphasis. I wanted to emphasize certain parts of his character, that being his face, because he's a little animal that acts like a human, so he's going to have facial expressions and so on. So you as the artist need to decide what you're going to emphasize and why. There's another concept here that we're looking at, and that most cartoons, most of them, not all, but most, are done using contour lines. So this guy's simplified. He's done using contour lines. He's put in an extraordinary or odd circumstance. He's standing on his hind legs and he's doing human things. That's what makes it whimsical, what makes it silly or kind of fun and entertaining. Cartoons describe the world in a way that's typically not possible. All right, in the middle we got an example of where fine art meets cartooning. This is kind of in that Japanese manga style right here, where we've got attention to all the facial proportions that you would learn in fine art. We've got attention to value, and it's kind of a sketchy, loose drawing, but it's done in a cartoony way. It's still simplified. There's still exaggeration going on there, and the parts that were exaggerated are mainly the eyes, the hair, and the mouth. The rest of it, there's really no value in it. Value meaning shades of gray and such. It's simply just to show off the features that are necessary. And over here we got an example of comic book art right over here. This is from my graphic novel. This is a fusion of Western style and Eastern style. So this is a mixture of realistic and not realistic. There's a use of contour lines. There's even some value in there, using grays and screen tones. Here are non-examples of cartooning. These are just realistic sketches. Two completely different examples in the fine arts. On the left, we got a teddy bear, and that was a still life study. On the right, we've got a photo reference study, drawn from a photograph. These are super realistic, but when we looked at those examples of cartooning, we saw some realistic drawings. Well, the purpose, again, of cartooning is to communicate a story, or to communicate an experience, or to show a value or a cultural undertone to communicate through to the audience. These are just simply drawings as they are. It's a drawing of a teddy bear just to do it. It's a drawing of a rabbit just to do it. In cartooning, and in all your future works, Always think, what is your story? What are you saying? What are the tiny details? What's the whole purpose of it? What are you focusing on, and how do you arrange what's in there to prop that up? These two examples, or non-examples I should say, lack all of those elements. They're purely just examples of different artistic techniques, and that's all. So in review, what's cartooning? It's a big, long definition that you should go over and look at again, and its main purpose is to communicate. And to communicate, you need to have something to talk about. So there's personality in there, there's story in there, there's expression, and there's all sorts of good stuff tying together. Cartooning's typically done to tell a story. Oftentimes it's whimsical, humorous, but sometimes it's also serious and action-packed. But mostly it's done for entertainment. Cartooning draws on fine arts techniques, regardless if you're self-taught or formally taught. There are many different types of cartooning. And finally, let's look at the center image here. Cartooning has character. It has personality. We can tell this character in the middle. He styles his hair. He has an age. He is a certain size. He's experiencing an emotion in this scene. All these little nitty-gritty details that factor into your piece, these are all things that you'll be aware of as you work. So I hope you found this helpful. I look forward to seeing you in class, and let's have some fun making some cartoons.